we being the directors, voted for this topic being adaptation and resilience for the conference. And me being a numpty and of little brain had to look it up and go, oh, what do we talk about? Adaptation is the process or actions that are taken so that living things are able to, or are better able to survive in new environments, in changing environments. So it's like a transformative process, whether it's reactive, backward-looking, or proactive, forward-looking. Resilience, on the other hand, is the condition or capacity to cope with shocks. So the ability to cope with changes and to recover from their impacts. So it's a bit like shock absorbing, evolving and adapting and transforming, but it's actually the ability to actually absorb that change. So these two words are so closely related that it's almost interchangeable in policy, academia, or even common parlance, but actually they're slightly different. Two sides of the same coin, but slightly different. And they can build or undermine each other. Let's look further. Actually, you think adaptation, that must be good, but actually there's something called the sunk cost effect, which is like if you put in so much effort and large-scale infrastructure investment and into something, say large-scale farming and irrigation system or something. Once it's in, even if the rainfall patterns change, whatever, you're very reluctant to abandon the changes made. So it can actually lead to a society become less resilient. Or, for example, putting in lots of flood defenses. It could actually lull people into a false sense of security as well and forget about it. And oh, we've done that already. And that could also decrease resilience by having done certain adaptation measures. But of course, it can also build on it. It can be complementary. And that's what we want, obviously. The concept of resilience and adaptation should be a complementary process. And it should also challenge status quo. While preserving existing structures and ways of being, it actually also transforms at small scale, large scale, throughout all the scales, profound, deep-rooted transformation, and also should be holistic and multidimensional in its approach for it to be successful. So it should enhance communities, social, human, natural, physical, fiscal capacities to cope and recover from impacts of climate change, biodiversity change, and all of that. So I like to think of it as holistic nurturing. And on that basis, this conference is about that holistic nurturing as much as possible. We can't cover everything in this conference. So today we'll look at it from a nature-based solution point of view. And tomorrow we'll look at it from a community-based solution point of view. So hopefully it'll cover a range of ideas and thoughts. And not doing the whole carbon tunneling thing, you know, and really focus on one thing and forget about something else, which I think as a human species, we tend to do a lot. So to encourage this holistic nurturing and adaptive transformation, we have set up a Slido, which will come up. Thank you. I hope you can join us and tell us what adaptation measures you feel could enhance our resilience that we might not have mentioned as a society, not just the conference, what might have been overlooked and that you think it ought to be more on the radar. We'll review comments that come up throughout the conference later on in the panel discussion, as well as tomorrow, and see what you might have come up with, because that'll be very, very interesting.
A great joy, and also with humility, in a deep sense of the word, which is the sense of right proportion. If you feel that you're too big, you don't serve the system that you are contributing. If you think that you're too small, also you don't contribute or activate the system. So it's with this aiming to have the right proportion. I'll be sharing some reflections on designing nature-positive, gender-sensitive cities this morning. And my talk will have 3 movements. Do I face here, possibly? Point there. Yeah, 3 movements. Why? Contextualizing. Why? Methodologies, the how, and what if. There will be the 3 movements of my talk. And of course, this conversation happens at the intersection of 2 mega trends informing the world we're living in. Mega trends, as we know, they are trends that unfold gradually, year by year, decade by decade, and then suddenly they become mega trends. So the decarbonization of our lifestyles and processes is a mega trend, but also the rapid urbanization of the human population. We have crossed the threshold of more humans in cities, and we are reaching the 70%, but not only that, today we do have about a Paris, equivalent to a Paris every 5 days is built in the world. So we know that cities, we put all the cities together, they cover 4% of the surface of the planet. That was too quick. They account for 80% of global energy consumption, 75% of carbon emissions, and 75% of the world's natural resources. From the 4% that they cover of the surface of the planet, 1.8 to 2 is made of roads and parking lots. That'd be 50% of the built environment. So, but before we enter into this conversation in the intersection between the rapid urbanization and the imperative of the decarbonization, I'd like to invite us to make one decision, one collective decision, and hold 3 awarenesses. I believe these awarenesses are alive in this room of ecological designers. So, the decision is about not using an old map to explore a new territory. What does it mean? It means that despite the fact that our generation is facing a convergence of multiple crises, we are letting go of a problem-solving mindset and instead adopting the notion of potential grounded in the biocultural, spatial uniqueness of place. Problem solving look backwards, potential look forwards. Potential is always grounded in the territory, in a system. For instance, the potential of Leith, where I live in Edinburgh, is not in Western Hales. The potential is always located in the biocultural spatial uniqueness of place. There's always more potential that that is yet to be realized. Therefore, today, I'd like us to invite us to start building this conversation in what is strong, not what is wrong. So that's the decision. Regarding the awarenesses, the first one, I just came back from the UN. I work for the UN system for 2 decades plus now. And we just had the Summit for the Future Summit. And Every time I come back from the UN, I come back pregnant of scenarios. We have so many scenarios ahead of us. If we're going to grow from 1.5 to 1.7, if the sea level is going to be 15 centimeters or 30 centimeters, there's hundreds of scenarios ahead of us projected by big data analysts, climate scientists, think tanks, economists, urbanists, futurists. We have hundreds of scenarios ahead of us, which we can synthesize them in two. Transition is going to happen. Either we're going to design it, or we're going to be victims of it. And we are aware that we are in the business of designing transition. And design, we see design as a collective exercise of envisioning, projecting, imaging. How are we going to redesign our human presence in urban environments? That's the first awareness. The second one is related to direction of travel. We are aware that sustainability is no longer enough. How can we sustainably bring back what we have already lost? Our lifestyles and linear economies have had a huge impact in the living systems. Therefore, here we are adopting the concept and the practice of regenerative design. That means that bringing more life, more vitality, more viability, which is vitality over time, to every system that we contribute and act upon. Here, by adopting a regenerative mindset and direction of travel, we start working with lifelines, not deadlines. That's the second awareness. The third one is about levels of work. Each one of us have a different realm of work, but basically we can see this as a nested system. The inner, the outer, and the systems work. The inner is about my own work, developing my capabilities, the way I tread on earth, how I am committed to diminishing, reducing my carbon footprint daily in my life. That's about the inner work. The outer is about working with people and projects. And the third level is about systems, which is working with people and projects to shift systems. And some of us are working separately on these levels or simultaneously in these levels. So it's really important as designers or redesigners of our human presence in urban environments that we know which level are we working. Where is my growing edge here? Oh, I feel more comfortable doing my inner work. Okay, this is comfortable enough. Okay, but what is your edge? What is your growing edge here? So with this decision and three awarenesses, we move into how then we can start doing that. What are the methodologicals? And we talk about lots about systems, right? But what is systems? Or how do I understand systems? I would say that there's 1,000, Rumi would say there's 1,000 ways of kneeling and kissing the earth. I would say there's 1,000 ways of defining a system. For this morning, adopted Donella Meadows' way because I think it's simple enough for us to have a common ground and continue with our reflection. Donella Meadows said that the system is a constellation of elements, sub-elements, parts, entities that are interconnected in such a way that they jointly serve an overarching purpose. So sometimes to shift a system is not only shifting or enhancing. Regenerative design is about enhancing the relationship between systems, bringing more life to this relationship of the elements in the systems that have a purpose. If the purpose is sustainability, the purpose is doing not as bad, but is not bringing more life. So systems thinking is, in this context, the underlying framework for seeing, naming, describing the relationship between these interconnections. Okay, moving from theory to practice. Recently, I conducted a research. I wanted to know what if women designed a city, how cities would function and look like. So I conducted a series of walk interviews, actually with 274 women from both affluent and hard-to-reach areas, from Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Perth. Each city, there was 2 types of neighborhoods. And I came with a huge amount of data. But it doesn't matter the data so much, but more about the method. First of all, remember saying that systems thinking is about the framework to look at the interdependencies between the parts within a whole that has a purpose. So I created a regenerative framework of inquiry. It started, I never wanted a woman to come with a wish list of things for city to work better for them, that somebody else was responsible. The council should do my first, second, third, fourth wish. I really wanted to be in a different way. So the first question was like, what is unique about your neighborhood? So when you start by asking what is unique, you already position the mindset of the person into what is the potential, following this, okay, so what is the potential that you see in the singularity, in the uniqueness of Wester Hailes, of Drumchapel? Every place has a uniqueness. So from the uniqueness, you build, the potential is always grounded in the uniqueness. So what is the potential you see? And then you have this potential being, expressed, shown, described, more than walk interviews, because it's a trialogue between the researcher and the participants and the place we traverse. Therefore, this is like sometimes the richness of walk interviews is that because they can show what is the potential more than describing. So from that, from the potential, then you move into what are the restraints. Every system has a restraint. You cannot be naive to say that there is only potential. Everything is potential. It's a force of the universe. You have action and reaction. You have, the universe expanding, and you have particles and waves. You always have the second force. You need to understand how to work with restraining forces. Welcoming restraining forces come to help you to shape and refine your design. So here you have the potential, and then here you have restraining force. In the dialogue between the two, you reconcile and you create new lines of work. So you ask and you identify restraining forces. And then you move the conversation to networks of responsibilities. This is an old paradigm that for this territory to work, one stakeholder is responsible for the happiness of my life. We need to really start working in defining, identifying the networks of responsibilities to enhance the system, the territory that we are contributing to, and sharing responsibility amongst them. And after that, because this was an emancipatory piece of research, I would say, okay, so if these are the network of responsibility, what is your role as a woman to make this potential to become a reality? And then you have this constellation of new roles that were discovered over the 274 women interviews, which were capsulated in a book that I'm launching right now called What If Women Designed a City? But that's not the case here. The case is that walk interviews. Why did I use walk interviews? I already said it is a multisensory way of exposing mental ideas in open air. and making new connections that you haven't done. One thing is to sit on a table, look at somebody, say, what is unique about your place? The other one is start walking and say, what is unique about your place? What is the potential? It's multisensory. You have the sound, you have the smells, you have your eyes. So it's possibly that you're going to be making more connections than having a one-to-one interview in a closed room. It also creates conditions for serendipity to happen. Because you may be walking and you never realize that this is a restraint or this is a potential. I've never seen this in active travel. Look at that. And then you make that connection. So you create conditions for serendipity as well. So it's a trialogue, it's multisensory. It creates conditions for serendipity and more other possible qualities that you as researchers may add to this when you enter into a conversation. By the way, somebody can tell me how many more minutes I have? Thank you. I had a huge amount of data because I created an app, a GIS map. So I had spatial data, I had visual data because in my app I have a state-of-the-art kind of a tablet that I was photographing, recording what they were saying and mapping. So I had this huge amount of data. I said, what do I do with that? So of course you need systems thinking for systems conversations. So I adopted a framework developed by Donella Meadows, who wrote about leverage points. She would say that there are places in a complex system where a small shift in one thing produce big changes in everything. That's something that Archimedes had said way back, give me a lever and I lift the world. And then Buckminster Fuller, anyone can be a trim tab, but she did create this framework. And remember saying that systems thinking is about a framework to look at systems. So that was the framework. There's hundreds and thousands of frameworks for you to analyze data. And that was the one I selected because I thought was pretty elegant in the way that what women were talking to me was not only infrastructural stuff. There were few things that were infrastructural, like larger pavements for prams or more lighting, but this was the minimum. There was so much more coming through the walk interviews that was about feedback, feedbacks that reinforce, or feedbacks that correct the pathway that my city or my neighborhood is going. There was so much about structure of the systems, or so much about shifting paradigm and mindset. So that was a very good framework. And I didn't see how many minutes. I have 15 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna use 5 more and then 10 for a conversation, because for me the most important. By the way, are you understanding my Brazilian English so far? Yeah? Okay, can I continue? Is it too theoretical? Little bit. Okay, let's continue. Okay, so I came into 33 leverage points. Of course, this is not a talk about my 33 leverage points, but I selected 3 that I think was somehow important for inspiring or framing the conversation that you're going to be taking over the next 2 days. But just to say that the leverage points, they that identified were under 4 thematic areas: sense of place, green space, active travel, and safety. But from the 33 leverage points, I'm going to start, let me just see which one was the first one. Yes, so I would say that if women design the cities, cities will be designed for proximity rather than motorized mobility. And active travel would be encouraged as style of life, as a way of life. Women reiterated again and again that they see streets for people, not cars. Cars will be invited and traffic evaporated. This combined with segregated cycle and pedestrian lines and a well-networked transport system designed for trip chain, which is something that's unique from women. They go in many, many places within a short time. Trip chain, one ticket. And also something that is called encumbered travel, which is very technical. Encumbered travel means traveling with bags and prams, lots of things. So transport system designed for trip chain and encumbered travel, with buses stopping on demand in the evening. This will have a huge impact in air quality, in climate, in health, in pace of life. The opening speaker was talking about nurturing. I thought that was very interesting because this leverage point is about changing the name of the departments in different municipalities or councils from Department of Maintenance to Department of Care. Something about renaming. So there's nothing more powerful from a community than realizing what they care for. When a community realizes what they care for, there is no power bigger than realizing what they care. So this is behind the leverage point of renaming departments of maintenance to Department of Care and distributing the responsibility of caring for a neighborhood, for a place, between all stakeholders, public, private, community, third sector, residents. A Department of Care will involve all the stakeholders in discussions. How can we improve our neighborhood or this aspect of our neighborhood? Doing more with less, using local labor, using local resources, and reducing the dependence on long supply chains that will be based, of course, in fossil fuel. And at the same time, reinforcing here the sense of community and the sense of place. A third leverage point, it's about cultivating biophilia. This is regarding access to green spaces. Women would say the importance of cultivating biophilia, love for the living things. A biophilic urban design will connect all pockets of greens, gardens, balconies, parks, burns, cemeteries, urban woodlands, in natural corridors, enabling wilderness returning, but most of all, creating the conditions for people of all ages to nurture the love for the living things and for living things to cross freely through the urban landscapes. Women believe that if you cultivate, if you nurture biophilia from childhood onwards, this will reduce disruptive behaviors in adolescence and the desire to control nature in adulthood. Therefore, as urban designers, we should create these corridors for living things and also for humans to develop, to have a possibility to develop the love for living things. These are 3 examples. And I was thinking as I was coming here today from Edinburgh and remembering the last week, which we have the Summit of the Future, which was being organized over the last year and a half. And alongside the Summit of the Future, there was this high-level meeting at the General Assembly on sea level rise. the first meeting at this level with Tuvalu. I remember that we brought Ambassador of Tuvalu to Finhorn about 10 years ago and to Inverness to a conversation about, this was 15 years ago, and now definitely sea level rise, it is in the agenda. So late, but doesn't matter, it is. So I thought about this meeting here. If we think about a world of nested systems, I think this conference here is like a microcosm of this larger conversation. And my hope is that that meeting here and this meeting here, we start working, putting our collective gaze, you know, focusing more and more collective gaze to lifelines and not deadlines. And understanding the world as a complex system where we need to go for the good of the whole. So if we don't have a vision of the future we want to create, we are never going to get there. I hope this conversation over the next 2 days is future-oriented, potential-oriented. And I'll leave you with a quote from Rainer Maria Rilke, who said, "The future needs to enter you much before it happens." So thank you very much for listening. And I think I have possibly 5 minutes for some commentaries or some further reflection, if there are any here.
Is this on? Yep.
It doesn't need to be questioned, it can be a reflection.
Okay, it's is this on? Yeah, it's maybe somewhere between the two. I thought great presentation. I can see you know, your thesis that this inner working to change our mental view of the future, and then through a place-based sort of collective approach to mapping out that change, and that women are have a clearer and more positive vision for that, and by extension perhaps children, and also through a rights of nature approach as well, that could map out a better future. But how do we give that agency? Is your to actually go down that future path? Is your proposition that it's really a shift in mental attitude that's the fundamental shift we need to make? And that thing that Buckminster Fuller said about when you're in a system that isn't working, the most powerful way of changing is to set up a new system that does work and makes the old system redundant. Is it that we're setting up a new mental system? Is that what you're driving at?
No, I'm actually working with existing systems, or we're working at the edge between systems, I think. As you know, that when two edges of the systems and not without the system or within the system, and I'll try to explain. When you see two ecosystems when they meet, like forest in savanna in my country, my home country, you have the buffer zone, you have the ecotone, from the Greek, ecology is intention, because you have the species of the forest, the species of the savanna, and you create in this buffer zone, which is very rich, it creates conditions for the specific species of that area. So in buffer zones, at the edges between systems, you have more potential. That's why there is one concept of, I should have had my talk here, by the way. I feel much more comfortable than there. Rewind. One of the principles of permaculture is maximize edges. When you're designing for more productivity in a land, because edges have more life. So in this context, I would say, yeah, our work between systems, not, there's some people right now that are prototyping completely the new, like the eco-village transition towns. And then some of them are working here with the UN Habitat, still, you know, putting protocols and agendas and trying to, you know, actually really rearranging the chairs of the Titanic, but they're doing their job here, and you have the prototypes here. In my way of working, I work between the two paradigms, but that's my way. Each one, remember talking about the 3 levels? Some people work with within peoples and projects. Peoples and projects, you may want to be, you know, doing what the C40 cities are doing. The C40 cities are very established. They're working together. They're cutting carbon emissions. They're very official, but they're still working in this paradigm. They are not so much prototyping what the eco-villages are doing or transition towns and things like that. So I work at the edges.
Anyone else? Thanks again. Yeah, just I think you've said in your introduction that it's roughly 4%, was it, of the world that is urbanized? I'm presuming that's urbanized rather than cities, because obviously in terms of the global scale, the biggest driver of urban change, I would say, is largely unplanned growth. And thinking of somewhere like Brazil, for example, the favelas, and you know, so design doesn't really come into that. And you're the premise there about what if women designed the city. Yeah, very relevant. But one of the questions I would have is, well, what if anyone designed a large part of the growth which is taking place primarily in the third world or the less developed countries? A lot of that growth is not planned at all. So design doesn't really feature there in terms of, you know, a lot of these kind of the more kind of unplanned peripheral areas of cities. That's where a lot of the growth is taking place. So whilst that's not really particularly relevant in the Scottish context, where we have, you know, we're dealing with the opposite really in Aberdeen, where you've got a lot of areas which are, you know, we're dealing with decline in a large part, and how you address the problems of that, where you've got large, for example, a lot of redundant industrial sites. How do you repurpose them? How do you incentivize active travel, where you've got increasing dependency on car travel? All of these questions are, so it's a different context, I think, between the urban areas that we have and where a lot of the growth is taking place on a global scale. And I just wonder, how do you drive change there in terms of planning and design?
Okay. Well, I always work with the bioculture spatial uniqueness of place, although I know that today we're building equivalent of a Paris every 5 days, particularly in the global south, as you said. You rightly said that. But at the same time, I practice in the south for many years. I'm from São Paulo, megalopolis, and I've been working with, but basically when you work in the global south, people say you're walking with us, because I learn as much as, you know, come there. And with Vila Brasilândia, which is the largest slum community in South America, 135,000 people, and also hosting in Rio de Janeiro. As an example, in Vila Brasilândia, the largest one, when we start walking with them, we realize that we have 135,000 people buying every day bread, because everybody eats bread every day. But there was not one bakery. Nobody knew how to bake bread in the whole of the settlement. They all use bicycles. Nobody could make bicycles there. So you start looking at the first of the, you look at the system as a whole. So where the money comes in and how the money goes out to start creating resilience. And so we realized money was coming in because these people work all over the megalopolis. They come back and they spend, and the money go out. So then you start, you know, plugging the leakages in the bucket, in the economic bucket, and you start creating business. So women start getting into how is to make bread, and you start making bakery. Then you have bakeries, and then you start say, how do we do bicycles? Can we do a factory of bamboo bicycles and things like? So I cannot give you like 5 things to do in slum communities in the global south. Each one is specific, and that's the approach where you work. I think that connects the two questions because it's my last piece of, it reminds me, the two questions together reminds me of my teacher at university, Paulo Freire. I'm not sure how many of you heard about Paulo Freire. He wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He was fundamental in my journey. And Paulo Freire used to say that every word that we sound, and I sounded many words today here for you, has two aspects. It has an aspect of reflection and an aspect of action. If you use that word, too much emphasizing reflection, that word becomes rhetoric. We should do this, we could do that. But if you also use that word and emphasize only action. I've been part of many social movements and environmental movements that say, let's change reality. Without enough reflection, you just really, you don't go to the deep roots of whatever in the system you want to, you know, bring a new direction. So the work of us as designers or redesigners of our human presence is really to look at how much reflection and to action we can balance. And then I'll leave this with you. I think I've already shared many words this morning. I hope they had a little bit of reflection and maybe seeds for action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, May. Good morning. Good morning. Just wait for the slides to appear. I'll just start by saying many, many thanks to SEDA and to Magda in particular for inviting me along. It's a real delight to be here and to share some thoughts around kinship. I can change the slide. Brilliant. Here we go. Yeah. And I'd also like to thank May for a brilliant opening presentation, and it resonates so much with what I'm going to talk about. Hopefully I can use some of the expressions you talk about here. Yes, if kinship with nature is the answer, and that's a point I've got to in my thinking, then what are the questions? What are the questions we should be asking? And a slight apology, actually. Sorry, just do it. The words at the bottom there should just be my name in a wonderful tree font, which was created by a lady called Katie Holton. I think is American or Irish or splits between the two. And she's done some absolutely fantastic work on how we can learn from trees. So sorry for the mess at the bottom. Maybe Google doesn't like the tree font as yet. So I want to start with probably an odd place to start. This is one of the most celebrated of haiku poems from Japan. And as you read it, just read one line at a time. This was written in the 17th century, 1600s or so, by a Japanese poet, Basho. It's one of the most famous, it's celebrated, and it speaks to our relationship with nature. And we're talking about the 1600s. But who's seen or heard this haiku before? Brilliant. At least, yeah. And you break it down. I think somehow it needs a translation. But when you think about an old pond, we can visualize that old pond, that history and that tradition. Yep. A frog jumps in, there's action, there's change, there's adaptation. And then a sound of water. Is that water a splash or is it a ripple? Where do those ripples go? And this is as I say, well celebrated poem. And it helps us to visualize something. It speaks to us like a story. It asks us to be mindful. We can see that pond, we can see the frog, we can see the ripples. Yeah. And we're starting to talk about storytelling in business, in all sorts of manners at the moment. And when we hear and read a good story like this, it triggers things. The same hormones that we will get when we're happy, when we go for a walk in nature, etc. And science is starting to show how powerful those stories are, which is why fairy tales are so powerful, why poems are so powerful, and why this is so powerful. And I do apologize. Again, I probably planted the equivalent of an earworm, and you'll be thinking about frogs and ponds and all sorts of splashes as we go through. So I just want to share my regenerative journey, and you'll probably be on some sort of similar journey. It may be going in different directions, but I think we're all moving from that business as usual into something which is sustainable and probably beyond. Yeah. And I got into thinking about things in a different way around 1987 and reading the Brundtland definition. Do nothing today to compromise tomorrow's generation. I know that's a simplification, but it hasn't worked, has it? You know, since 87, what was that? Is that the equivalent of 2 generations? And tomorrow, and the future generations are even more compromised now than they were. And along the way, my thinking has changed from being about sustainable, and the future restorative there is, subtitled, working towards a new sustainability. And I think, what's coming next? What's coming down the line? Restore 2030 tries to visualize what a city in Europe would look like in 2030 if it was to bring regenerative ideas in. I'm a great advocate of the Living Building Challenge and the ILFI work mentioned in a moment, but we brought that into Restore 2030. And then a regenerative playbook. And what is regenerative and how can we make that simple? But what I'm questioning now is where we go beyond that sort of regenerative, if there is a beyond regenerative. And just wonderful questions I'm framing and helping other people to understand. And I've used this slide for quite a while. And how did we move from ego to eco? And then how do we move it into SEDA? SEDA is a fantastic Sanskrit word for being in service to nature, being part of nature, being connected. And if you did a search on ego, eco, SEDA, you'll see that it's originated way back in a few decades ago in India. But that ego started with the Industrial Revolution and the Ravi Burns man's tyrannical dominion sort of approach. But as we just saw from that haiku poem, there's much more beyond, before the ego. And then what does that SEDA mean? And that bit in the middle, the eco, probably started in 87 with the Brundtland definition, etc. And we've hooked onto that. And we're locked into this eco period of 30 years, 40 years. And we really haven't changed the needle in the right direction. We have all the wonderful carbon tools. We have all the wonderful waste approaches, but they're not really moving things as fast as we want to. And it was good to hear from Maeve about that first line of work. And that's something I want to focus in on. Sorry. And who are we and what do we bring to sustainability, regenerative, etc. I'm writing this regenerative playbook. I'll share all the links to these at the end, or a link where you can pick them all up. And it's about going on that journey. It's about being humble and say, okay, we don't have all the solutions. What can we learn? We might have just written or used one of the latest carbon guides, etc. But we need to be humble and think, how do we make this scale up? And what? But the words spent some time putting together, I really love this. Being ready to learn from those communities who have steward traditional knowledge about how we live in good relationship with our planet and whose voices are often marginalized. And it means asking different and better questions. So we think about moving on from the Industrial Revolution with that ego to eco, but what was all that stuff which happened way before? And the question I'm framing in my mind is this type of, what is it that the earth is asking of me? And I encourage you to think about that. That's not my statement. That comes from the wonderful Robin Wall Kimmerer. And if you haven't read Bread and Sweetgrass, there's a treat there for you. And that leads into that the relationship that we have with nature. And Robin Wall Kimmerer is a Native American. Try to pronounce the peoples that she belongs to, but Potawatomi. But she talks about we need to really understand elements of nature. We need to know things by name. And to call a 1,000-year-old tree it is just completely disrespectful. Yeah. And so she suggested the word key. So we talk about things in nature, the tree, the river, etc., as key rather than it. And I think once you move into that mind frame, the next stage to kin is quite logical. Yeah. And again, from Braden Sweetgrass and other indigenous writings, the idea that that tree could be my grandmother in a current life, and I may well be the deer, or I may well be that blade of grass into the future, just creates that relationship much deeper before us and after us. And that's quite powerful thinking. And that leads into that whole idea of kinship, that we have a better and more deeper understanding with nature. And if we can bring that together into our companies and into our projects, that's where we need to be. I'm reading from Robin Wall Kimmerer and Braden Sweetgrass, etc., and where I'm going, and I know others are on the same route. This wonderful honourable harvest, which is the sort of the creed of indigenous people in the States, and I guess elsewhere. And what if we were all to follow this? Wouldn't it be beautiful to think that to take only what we need and use everything we take? Yeah, if we did that with personal conviction, and we took that to our projects, and we took that to our organizations, and to take only what's given. Yeah. Robin talks, if you hear her talk, she talks about the new development and the new construction project that asks the land, can I build a supermarket here? And listens to the answer. And then decides to or not to. And so asking for permission to take that fruit for a harvest, asking for permission before we build something on that land, and then abiding by the answer. I just think this is all very powerful and insightful. And then shaping, my thoughts are shaped by these others. Joanna Macy, in particular, wonderful Buddhist interpretation of what she calls the regenerative self, or an ecological self. And it's all about the story that's in us. We know what's in us. We just need the opportunity to express it. And she calls it the story of deep kinship. Arne Nasse, ecological philosopher, also about our coexistence, the interbeing aspect. And we're bringing that into the work that I'm doing and others are doing in association around the regenerative self. Who are we? What do we bring? And the chart on the side there is, once we've got the regenerative self, we'll never understand it, but once we start questioning it, then we can think about the regenerative organization, the regenerative construction company, the regenerative architect practice. And then, maybe only then, we can really have powerful regenerative projects, deeply ecological, deeply sustainable projects. And it's all based on that individual, who we are, what we do, how we show up, and what we bring to the projects. These two quotes here are from a adventure, Alistair Humphreys, who cycled around the world and some wonderful things. But he's moved, and you can see it in his writing, in his books over the time, he's moved in that same direction. And so last year he just said, I'm going to explore an area, I think it was 25 kilometers. Everything I do in terms of adventure, it's going to be within 25 kilometers square of my home, and really get into the place of that. And his book, Local, is absolutely fascinating read of how he visits each ordnance survey square meter, kilometer. And those two quotes there, as the world gets more tech-filled, noisy, distracting, nature, of course, becomes louder. And I think we can also share that. Yeah, sometimes we just want to switch off all those messages, those emails, those WhatsApps, and just go for a walk or sit in a park. And on sitting in a park or whatever, he said, yeah, the good recommendation is you should sit in nature for... That was automatic. You should sit in nature for 20 minutes every day. And if you don't have time for that, you should sit there for an hour. And I think that's good. And that list on the side is sort of things that I just do a quick brainstorm on for myself. Is that finding that stolen time? I think we can all agree our time has been stolen by social media, by messages, by TV, by all sorts of things. And we need to really find that. And then we can start noticing. If I start doing art rather than taking a photo, you know, our phones are probably filled with thousands and thousands of images. But if we start to try and sketch it, however badly, then it sticks in the brain and we get that better connection. Just sit there doing nothing. The whole idea of grounding, work out where you are in that place at that time. And being present. We could talk about mindfulness and all those sorts of things, but it's about being, just being there and spending that time in nature. And there's an expression of atoms of delight, which popped up in another poem. The name escapes at the moment, but I'll share it later. And we all come across these wow moments, those moments of awe. They're sort of atoms of absolute delight, aren't they? This was Village Green, just outside my home, with the Northern Lights back in May. And I think we had a fantastic display, probably better here in Aberdeen than it was down in Lancashire. But it's not it. There was a guy sat on our village cross steps. This is about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I just had a wonderful chat with him about cosmos and what's happening, etc., with these Northern Lights display above. And it was a sort of goose pimply moment, so always is with these lights. And we thought, well, yeah, we understand what's happening now. How would we understand that 200 years ago when that, 300 years ago when that cross was constructed? And then just last weekend in my garden, absolute joy to see a new mushroom appeared. This is a deceiver, I believe, and the cyclamen of autumn's appearing. Like, wow, these are really good moments. And that reflection, how can I bring that into my work? How can I bring that into supporting people on their regenerative journeys? That sort of leads me into this and asking you to either scribble something down or to just think about these three spheres. This comes from a brilliant author and consultant, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. All the links are at the end. But in terms of resilience, it's that meeting place between these three. And we use this in some of the workshops we're doing, etc. So what are you good at? Okay, right, sorry, yeah. The top one is, so the top is what gives me joy. What are those atoms of delight? Yeah, the things I've just mentioned. But it could be family, it could be a walk in nature, it could be topping a Munro, it could be all sorts of things. What is that? Yeah, what ignites me? And down the bottom here, what am I good at? Yeah, it could be writing, it could be design, it could be architecture, it could be construction, it could be family life, it could be anything. Yeah. And then the bottom one down here is, what is the earth asking of me? What am I here to do? What do I know in my soul, in my being, that I'm here to do? And if we can bring all those together, then we end up in the center there with that sort of resilience for ourselves and resilience for our practices and our companies, but also then for the built environment and wider into the third line of work with the systems. And starting to do this on projects, when the project team meets for the first time, introduce it as an icebreaker. But get people to think about, oh God, yeah, what is the earth asking me to do? Why am I here? What's my calling, relationship on this? I do time, right. I do upset some of the people I do audits with as a provocateur. If I introduce myself as that, I can be provocative. And I said, okay, if nature had a place around your project table here, what would they be saying? How would you bring that into the design? That works well. I've just one more slide or two. I know Rand's waving at me. So just a couple of sort of random thoughts on not random thoughts, but list of thoughts on resilience, because only 20 minutes I could talk on this all day. Probably won't want to listen all day, but I mentioned storytelling up front. Yeah. In terms of getting messages across, storytelling is probably one of the most powerful things we have. We will remember a story. We remember the fairy tales. We won't remember that carbon figure you've quoted in your latest submission, but we will remember the story of how you got there. Yeah, and we'll feel good if it's a good news story. I do a lot of work with ISO 1000, ISO 9000, 14,000 with companies. Recently, they've just changed. There's now a requirement in there to identify the climate impact of interested parties. So that's your supply chain, your clients, the community, etc. And it's a fantastic opportunity to introduce nature as an interested party in your business, in your project. And they're little triggers. There's lots of organizations that have ISO standards on quality, environment, health and safety, etc. And they're very receptive to this. I'm surprised and encouraged. Yeah, and that's sort of deepening that resilience as we go forward. Emotional durability, what makes that jacket I bought 20, 30 years ago really valuable to me? What's that emotional durability, and how can I apply that to projects? Future leadership, how do we develop leaders going into the future that pick up all these? And just to leave you with the one thought here on weavers and weaving, I think it's a brilliant metaphor of how we can bring all those threads together, the social, the ecology, the technical, community. How do we bring all that in together for a project or an organization? Who are the future weavers in your business, etc.? And those weavers, yeah, you think about Scotland, and you think about indigenous weavers around the world, are really based within place and using local materials. So I think it's a great metaphor. And yet, just one final slide to leave you with, as we finish the playbook with what's not to like. Yeah, we get this all right. In fact, there's a fantastic book just been released. It's next on my reading list by the person who came up with those 3 Venn diagrams. And it's called What If We Got It Right? And it's just full of hope and looking into the future. Yeah, let's bring all these regenerative words to bear. Thank you for listening. Yeah.